Hello, and welcome to the Rad Book Club. I'm your host, David J.W. Now, admittedly, I'm a little bit late to this story, but it's important, and I wanted to talk about it. At the end of May, the Ontario government announced that it was going to be unboxing and reaffirming the statue of John A Macdonald at Queen's Park. And according to the Canadian press, the statue of Canada's first Prime Minister has been boxed up since 2020, when it was vandalized amid a wave of protest across the country that took aim at Macdonald as Canadians grappled with the history of residential schools. Macdonald is considered an architect of the country's notorious residential school system that took Indigenous children from their families in an effort to assimilate them. The Canadian press article goes on to quote Saul Mamakwa, a New Democrat who is the only First Nation member at Queen's Park, who said the government is not listening to Indigenous voices on a large number of issues. So they go on to quote, "It's not just a statue," he said. "It's a statue of oppression. It is a statue of colonialism. It is a statue of Indian residential schools," unquote. He told the board of the Legislative Assembly studying the issue to either move it to a museum as a piece of art or keep it but build a memorial for residential schools. The board chose neither. And I should say that was a board of both conservative and liberals. And that's according to the Canadian press. Now, fans of John A cry that history is being discarded when monuments are vandalized or removed. You've all heard it. But this is denialism. Denialism is the problem, not the lack of historical understanding. Statues don't represent history. They are symbols of what the dominant culture chooses to preserve, protect, and promote. I personally believe that denial of the mass deaths, the forced displacement, ethnic cleansing, and the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada should be viewed as a form of Holocaust denial. And I can't help but notice that the people who wish to minimize and dismiss the harms that were done to Indigenous people and are continuing to be done to Indigenous people are the same people who want to protect, preserve, and promote the perpetrators of those harms, such as John A. Macdonald or Egerton Ryerson, which is the what my former university was named after. Now, the victors write the history. We all know that. And historians either perpetuate those narratives and deny any inconvenient truths, such as policies of land theft and confiscation, forced assimilation to the Indigenous or colonizer culture, and ethnic cleansing and genocide. Those are just the realities, and that's the reality of how this country was founded. An excellent example of this phenomenon was published in the National Post, the flagship rag of the billionaire hedge fund propaganda machine called Chatham Asset Management, also known as Postmedia. Postmedia is the largest media company in Canada, owned by U.S. hedge fund billionaires. After the unboxing of the statue of John A was announced, the National Post ran an opinion column by Greg Piasetzki, a Toronto intellectual property lawyer and senior fellow at an alleged think tank called the Aristotle Foundation. This group appears to exist in order to promote settler colonialism, European supremacy, and the denial of facts, such as institutional racism in Canada, the historical and ongoing genocide of Indigenous people in Canada, and the current Gaza Holocaust. The Aristotle Foundation denies all of these facts. In his op-ed, Mr. Piasetzki claims that the government in Macdonald's day respected the wishes of Indigenous families who were not forced to keep their children in school beyond the early grades. Clearly, neither Macdonald's government nor any succeeding one was engaged in genocide, cultural or otherwise, unquote. Garbage. Utter historical revisionism and denialism. In my opinion, this is straight up denial of the historical reality. Specifically denial of the genocidal, eugenicist nature of the residential school system in Canada. And of course, Piasetzki provides no evidence for his claims of benevolence on the part of Macdonald and company. Just nothing, just claims it. He goes on to claim, quote, "There were also a number of initiatives of Macdonald's government that likely saved tens of thousands of Indigenous lives and are equally inconsistent with the notion he had any interest in genocide." All right, let's see which initiatives that he claims here. The Macdonald government created the Northwest Mounted Police to protect the legal rights of both Indigenous people and settlers and to deter incursions from the United States. Now, like, the first part of that is just blatant revisionism, that the idea that the Northwest Mounted Police were formed to protect the rights of Indigenous people. That is a sick, twisted fucking joke. Piasetzki claims that Macdonald's founding of the Northwest Mounted Police was intended to assist and protect Indigenous people, which is, in my opinion, my personal opinion, a straight-up inversion of the historical truth. Like, the writer goes on to quote an Indigenous leader who praised the future RCMP back in 1877, but totally ignores the long and bloody history of ethnic cleansing, of displacement, surveillance, and extrajudicial killings of Indigenous people by the RCMP, which continues to this day. To this day, the RCMP is continuing to kill Indigenous people, to target, surveil, and murder Indigenous people. That is happening to this day. Now, I'm personally not an Indigenous person. I am a settler in Canada, descended from Europeans who settled here after the Second World War. Now, it's clear to me, all the years that I've spent in Canada, as it should be clear to anyone with eyes and half a brain, that this country was founded on white supremacy and Indigenous displacement and genocide. But what Piasetzki does is invert the historical reality. He claims that, quote, when the buffalo population collapsed, Macdonald immediately initiated what was certainly the largest famine relief operation in Canadian history. This is wild, okay? Absolutely wild, this claim. He doesn't mention the fact that the buffalo were exterminated by white hunters in order to starve and forcibly relocate the Indigenous populations. Doesn't mention that. And ethnically cleanse the land in favor of European settlers. Just in Gaza today, famine relief would not have been necessary for Indigenous people in Canada if it were not for the European settler colonial violence and occupation. Do you want to hear that again? Right? The killing of the buffalo was a part of the forced migration, the forced ethnic cleansing of Indigenous people. And yet here Piasetzki claims that Macdonald saved those people after the buffalo populations collapsed. It's just gross. He ends his puff piece with this line: "We can't build a better country by forgetting the people and the blood, sweat, and tears that got us to this point." End quote. But here's the problem. People like Greg Piasetzki and the institutions such as the National Post, Postmedia, and the Aristotle Foundation exist in order to help erase inconvenient people and histories. These people and groups, the dominant voices in our society, appear to be intent on denying and disappearing the cold hard facts about this blood-soaked country. Like it or not, this country was founded on the mass death of Indigenous people and the theft of their lands for the purposes of social control and resource extraction by Europeans, specifically European men. It's not a coincidence that John A. Macdonald's statue is being unboxed and re-legitimized at the same time as the Ontario Premier Doug Ford is ramming through Bill 5, the one to extract resources and raw materials from the Ring of Fire. As reported by the Canadian Press, quote, news of the Macdonald statue being uncovered comes at the same time that many First Nations leaders and communities are furious with the government over a proposed law known as Bill 5 that would create so-called special economic zones where it can suspend provincial and municipal laws on certain projects. The so-called, the law and order candidates breaking the laws, creating special zones to break the laws. The article goes on, it intends to designate the Ring of Fire, the first such zone, in an effort to speed up mining projects in the area that is said to be replete with critical minerals. The Ring of Fire is 450 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, Ontario, and home to several remote First Nations. Quote, the timing of unboxing Sir John A Macdonald's statue here at Queen's Park and also very close to having the third reading of Bill 5 is very disrespectful, Mamakwa said. Quote, this is not reconciliation, unquote. So, what do we have here? In reality, the historical figure of John A. Macdonald didn't care for anything other than political power and the privilege of white men, specifically English-speaking white men. And as much grain alcohol as he could pour down his throat. I mean, the guy was an absolute alcoholic. I mean, he used to puke in the wastebasket in the House of Commons. This is the guy that we're supposed to venerate. It's hard to believe that such a man cared about Indigenous people who were viewed as the main impediment to nation building. I don't want to stress that again, right? Indigenous people at that time were viewed as the main impediment to nation building. And what's happening right now, we have the provincial government in Ontario and the federal government in Ottawa claiming that they're doing nation building and ignoring Indigenous people. They want Indigenous people out of the way while they nation build. What kind of a nation building project is that? All these years later, we still have political leaders like Doug Ford and Mark Carney who are ready to ignore the rights and realities of Indigenous people in favor of settler colonial resource extraction, corporate control, and private profit. But don't take my word for it. Here's an excerpt from Egoists and Autocrats, George Bowering's popular history of Canada's prime ministers. It's not exactly a Marxist perspective of Canadian history that people like Jordan Peterson and Jack Granatstein are so afraid of. They're so afraid of the Marxists. It only relates also, this reading, to Macdonald's first term as Prime Minister, and it doesn't touch on Macdonald's policy towards Indigenous peoples. Admittedly, this book excerpt that I'm about to read doesn't include that. Instead, this book offers critical and sometimes satirical insights into the deeply corrupt and hateful man, whose bronze effigies we are encouraged to worship without question. And I, for one, am interested in questioning. So let's hear part of the unflattering true story of Canada's first Prime Minister, John A Fancypants. Join me for a reading, won't you? John A Macdonald was not in favor of Confederation. He was a Scot, a Brit. He was definitely not a US American. He detested the structure of the Republic that was grabbing up all the good earth to the south and west. He saw states' rights as a feature of ragtag democracy, of anarchism. He often announced his ill feeling towards all the recent isms. He liked the British model, in which the counties offered no threat to the power of the national parliament. If there was going to be a joining of the British North American colonies, Macdonald was going to push for the British model. Still, he was a prominent speaker at the booze sessions in Charlottetown in Quebec and London that led to the Union of 1867. In the famous painting of the Dads in front of those improbable windows in Charlottetown, one might look around and find Charles Tupper and Thomas D'Arcy McGee, but one does not have to look for John A. Macdonald. He is in about the position occupied by Jesus Christ in Da Vinci's Last Supper. There he stands, a sheet of symbolic paper in his hand, our Father among fathers. The fathers are sitting or standing still, as if for a group portrait, as if there were a painter where you are. That was very unlikely, given the amount of liquor these men were putting away. In that way, too, Macdonald was the father of fathers. If it was a wonder that this gathering of tipplers could get anything like nation building done, it is at least doubly amazing given the material they had to work with. A daunting spread of wild frontier with bad weather, a few muddy towns, French speakers who feared English domination, Protestants who hated popery, businessmen who liked the look of the US dollar, farmers who desperately needed protection against imported produce, a huge federal government to the south that would finish its civil war and find a large mechanized army at its fingertips, and a mother country that could not be trusted to not sell out its most northerly child in its effort to make peace with Washington. A British subject I was born, a British subject I will die, said John A. shortly before he did the latter. He was also born a city boy, and as a man who was so prominent in a decidedly countrified nation for half a century, he knew very little about people in the boonies. Farm louts were people to buy votes from. Louis Riel was some loony who stood in the way of a nation that would stretch from sea to whining sea. He was born in Glasgow on January 11th, 1815. His father, Hugh, was a cotton broker who just never had any luck. 5 years after John's birth, He moved with his wife and 4 children to Kingston, Ontario, determined to try his business skills in the promising colonial town named after the unlucky George III. But fortune in the New World was just as elusive. Hugh Macdonald opened a store, then tried to run a mill, then opened another store. He lost his shirt. Finally, he went to work as a clerk in a bank. His son John took on somewhat larger challenges, but he was just as unlucky with money. Kingston had a population of only 2,500 souls, many of them Scottish, but it was situated where Fort Frontenac once was, at the end of the Big Lake and the head of the Big River, across this water from New York State. It was even the capital of Upper Canada for a while. It was a good place to be a lawyer with an eye to politics. Young John went to school for 5 years, read every book he could lay his hands on, and at age 15 went to work as a clerk in a law office. He didn't make much money, but somehow he managed to develop a taste for spiffy clothes. He was tall and gangly and had a long, knobby nose and wild, frizzy hair. He thought that he could best set off those arresting features with loud checked trousers. There would be no prime minister that would come close to him as a sartorial adventurer until the arrival of Pierre Trudeau with his capes and March hare hats in the 1960s. He also liked to have fun. He had a droll wit and was not averse to yucking it up in the pub. There is a persistent rumor that when he was a student, he went with a friend to small towns in upstate New York. Macdonald in checked pants, squeezing a concertina, his pal in a bear outfit, dancing Celtic steps, gathering loud comments and Yankee coins from the rubes. This was Canada's answer, perhaps, to the Fenian raids. It was also the last time Macdonald would do a monkey act for the Americans. At the age of 21, he went up to Toronto and took what passed for law examinations in those days, becoming a barrister and a young Tory. He was popular with the locals, flippant and bibulous, good at telling dirty jokes, making sure that he knew everybody's name. They should have known that he was learning how to be a successful politician. He had defined his brand of conservatism. He would not be a doctrinaire walrus Tory, but a British subject open to liberal ideas, a progressive conservative. He was not a reformer, and he hated the idea of republicanism. He was a liberal conservative, a man who, for instance, shared the unusual prejudices about French Canadians, but advised that they be treated with respect. He was no friend of the family compact, although he knew how to make deals with rich and powerful Tories. As a young man, he worked behind the scenes, organizing meetings, carrying messages, suggesting alliances, getting himself known to all the conservative politicos and businessmen along the lake. When in 1843 an assembly candidature became available, 28-year-old Macdonald's name was entered almost before anyone noticed. He won and began his career as a hard-working backbencher with sharp eyes and friendly demeanor. He was making himself indispensable. He was learning compromise and moderation. He was becoming the perfect Canadian politician. In the Assembly, crowded with lots and lots of factions from both Canadas and both religions, he began surrounding himself with liberal conservatives. He made an alliance with the Anglophile Georges-Étienne Cartier, leader of the Conservatives in French Canada. But he was everybody's friend, or so it seemed. You could always expect a wink and a slap on the back from the casual-talking, merrily quipping young man with the long nose and checked trousers. He might have read every book in print, but he was no snob. he did not go home early from the pub. Macdonald liked to hang around in the inn, making jokes and slinging gab, being a hearty man's man. But we don't hear about any excessive chasing after long Victorian skirts. He did his chasing after votes. He learned the relationship between money and elections, and the Conservatives found him to be a productive backroom lad. His rewards would not be monetary, but political. Step by step, he rose in the hierarchy, and bit by bit, his hard work and administrative skills attracted associates who wanted to be on the winning side. He did not chase skirts, but he spotted one during a trip to Scotland and fell into a sad and romantic love with his cousin, Isabella Clarke. He brought her back to Kingston in 1843, the year he entered the Assembly, and began family life with a woman who would almost immediately become an invalid. There's been a lot of speculation about Isabella's condition. It has been called psychosomatic, the vapors, consumption, and most recently, chronic fatigue syndrome. In any case, she was a sickly wife, though she had at first been gay and playful. John A. was consumed by her condition. He overcome his repugnance for the U.S. and took her south, hoping to cure her condition in a warmer climate. John the A-type, Macdonald, was used to working harder than any 6 men, but now he kept telling himself that he should quit politics. He sat at his wife's bedside in America, spas, and in the drab house they stayed in while the Assembly was in session in Toronto. But there was a political party forming around him, the Liberal Conservatives. They should have been called the Macdonalds. When the British North America Act was passed in London, Queen Victoria pronounced Macdonald the first Prime Minister of the new entity. But what choice did she have? The moderate centre would define the Canadian state. Macdonald epitomized the moderate centre. At Charlottetown in London, he had even used his amazing bonhomie to bring his great enemies, George Brown and Nova Scotia, to the bar. Actually, Brown was for Confederation before Macdonald was. But once Confederation looked like the best bet, Macdonald turned on the energy. No Queen of England was going to make a fiery liberal newsman such as George Brown the head of government in her new dominion. As soon as the act was promulgated, George Brown took a few steps away from his fellow midwife and began the serious business of loyal opposition. He had the Globe, and Macdonald didn't have a newspaper. Brown would bring the old compromiser down. Hugh Macdonald did not live with his parents much. His father was working and drinking 24 hours a day, and his mother was an invalid. He grew up with other relatives. His mother faded and faded, finally giving up the Geist in 1857. Macdonald père had 10 years to devote his attention to the birth of a nation. But in 1856, he had seen a good-looking woman at a hotel dining room and asked the simple question, who might that be? In 1860, he finally met her. She was Susan Agnes Bernard, daughter of a colonist who had left Jamaica after the slaves were freed. They were married in grand fashion in February 1867, during the last stages of the Confederation Conference, feted by British and British North American Act politicians. Macdonald quipped that as an honest minister, he was applying the principle of union to his own life. Susan vowed to abstain from alcohol, hoping to set a good example. She also took great interest in the process of nation-making, and in years to come could be spotted in the parliamentary gallery, stamping her foot or scowling at George Brown or smiling at her husband's wit. In 1856, Macdonald wrote these typical words in a letter to his mother. I am carrying on a war against that scoundrel George Brown, and I will teach him a lesson that he never learnt before. I shall prove him a most dishonest, dishonorable fellow, And in doing so, I will only pay him a debt I owe him for abusing me for months together in his newspaper. That abuse included cartoons showing Macdonald in his check trousers with a bottle in the pocket of his stylish jacket. Brown was born in Edinburgh, Macdonald in Glasgow. Brown's father had gone to the United States before coming to Ontario. Brown was the gathering point for the true grits, for the supporters of Rep by Pop. He wanted Canada West to become huge and mainly Protestant. He accused John A. Macdonald of being the front man for the banks and businesses, for the old family compact. Macdonald accused Brown of being the heir of William Lyon Mackenzie. In truth, they were both supporters of business and the British Empire. They were both good compromisers when there was a target in sight. They even took cabs together in London in 1867. Macdonald would have more dangerous enemies than George Brown. After the first election, when Macdonald breezed in, Brown decided to be a newspaper man instead of a prime minister. He still ran his cartoons, but in an age when just about all politicians were hitting the bottle. The voting public did not seem to mind when they heard John A. barfing in the House, and they did not always know it when he disappeared for a while. As Macdonald saw it, his main job was to establish the power of the Dominion government over that of the provinces. To him, that meant the ascendancy of the British connection over the bad example of the United States down south. Tesla. It also meant scooping up all the Western and Northern territory that had once been the purview of the fur companies. Macdonald did not know a lot about the prairies, and he did not care much either. He was a city boy, and he knew how to get from hotel to hotel in London, England. But he did not want anyone else gathering up land that Canada could claim. He had been watching what the Americans were doing in Spanish North America and Russian North America. In his personal letters, Macdonald revealed a common Upper Canada combination of disdain and judiciousness regarding the French. Just as politicians and landowners in the far west were to assume in their Huxleyan way that the North American Indians were going to disappear in the natural course of things, so many Anglos judged that the outnumbered French-speaking Canadians would eventually cease to be a problem. Macdonald made a lot of mistakes about money, North American Indians, and the French. In October of 1844, while the future Prime Minister was taking his seat for the first time as a backbencher in a Conservative government, Louis David Riel was born in the Red River settlement out there in the unimaginable West. He was a Métis, created by the two peoples that Ontario Anglos considered extraneous to the future. Two decades later, while the fathers of Confederation were putting down whiskies and clauses, Riel was in Montreal being schooled for the priesthood and studying law. In 1868, after his first short residency in the USA, he was back in Saint-Boniface, preparing to create a country. Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory were ill-defined and crying out for lines on the map. The Hudson's Bay Company had been running things for 2 centuries. Then, in 1811, the Earl of Selkirk had got permission to establish the Red River Colony, which he called Assiniboia, around the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers. Scottish people were supposed to arrive and develop the farmland, but the locusts and floods made life hard. Eventually, the Selkirk family handed the colony over to the Hudson's Bay Company to manage. In fact, a lot of the population was made of Scots and French who had worked for the company, the Scots and French and their native wives, and the Métis descendants of the Scotch and French who had married native women generations before. By the 1860s, there was a multiracial community in the Red River Colony that had got used to thinking of their land and people as a nation. loyal to the crown, different as hell from the domain of the family compact. But the British North American Act provided that vast ranges of land west of Canada, would be transferred to the new Confederation. The 300,000 square kilometers of Selkirk's colony were to be included. The French-speaking Catholic Métis people had worked hard through hard times to make a political entity of their own. They were way to hell and gone out there somewhere, but they knew what to expect from the Orange men of Upper Canada. Someone may have mentioned these unsophisticated sentiments to Macdonald, but it was hard to get Macdonald's attention with rural matters, especially with rural matters expressed by non-entities. No, Macdonald did not know what to expect from Louis David Riel, but the handsome, dagger-eyed Riel knew what to expect from Macdonald and the liberal conservatives he would eventually annihilate. Macdonald's government gave the Hudson's Bay Company $1.5 million for the prairies, including the Red River Basin. The 30,000 people there never heard anything about Canada's plans for the land they had become used to owning. But the Canadians had their own plans for it. Louis David Riel, a 24-year-old orator in Victorian tailcoat and buckskin moccasins, pointed out that no Canadian official had yet stood in their country and declared ownership. Riel and his horsemen rode into Fort Garry, took down the HBC flag, and declared a provisional government, loyal to the Queen and representing the people of Assiniboia. The news got back to Ontario by telegraph from North Dakota. John A. Macdonald could not believe his eyes. He had always, despite his personal feelings, insisted on cordial relations with the Catholic French speakers in Lower Canada. In a now famous letter written in 1856, he had said, "If a Lower Canadian British desires to conquer, he must stoop to conquer. He must make friends with the French without sacrificing the status of his race and language. He must respect their nationality." But the upstarts along the Red River were not just the French. They were French-speaking half-breeds. They were inconsiderable rebels against his dream of a nation stretching to the Pacific. He had shouldered a musket in the 1837 rebellion. Now he reached for Wandering Willie. This was William McDougall, who got his nickname because he had a habit of jumping from one political faction to another. Now he was a Liberal member of Macdonald's cabinet, and Macdonald decided to solve two of his problems with one brilliant stroke of the pen. He sent Wandering Willie out to be the Lieutenant Governor of Rupert's Land. He would preside over the transfer of power and oversee a crew of surveyors. People who have lived on their farms for a few generations do not like to see surveyors from some distant land setting up their equipment. The Métis people did not in any way see the approaching McDougall as their Governor General or Lieutenant Governor. They were afraid that they were going to lose the farms and language and schools they had been used to. Their Red River country was not officially lost to the Easterners until the Easterners plunked themselves down and read some sort of proclamation. They decided to stop Wandering Willie from speechifying. Here was another nifty irony for Macdonald's career. The original Selkirk grant included territory that had now been in the United States since 1818. The Métis people had ties that were older and stronger than any 49th parallel. There were American spies all over the place, and Macdonald had a perfectly reasonable fear that the Americans might prove fond of acquisition. But he had heard the news of the Red River disturbance via U.S. telegraph lines. And when he sent his man, McDougall, west, he had to send him through the northwestern United States. Wandering Willie was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and as soon as he had counted his 60 wagons of belongings, was off north to his new seigneury. It has been said that William McDougall was the possessor of a stupidity that could not be made to falter by the most formidable light of reason. But how did he then rise to become a prominent liberal, you may ask? Keep reading. He arrived with his cortege of wagons at the Canadian border. The irony continued as a group of silent Métis men sat their horses and blocked the road into Canada. Wandering Willie decided to stay over in Pembina, North Dakota for the nonce. There he bided in a log cabin in the snow and tried to think, meanwhile managing to provide comic relief to U.S. reporters who sent eastward dispatches that would eventually reach his prime minister. At last, McDougall arrived at what appeared to be, to him, an idea. One sub-freezing night, he and a few of his men clambered aboard a wagon and rode through a hell-driven blizzard across the international boundary. There they got out and stood in the snow, one side of each man turning white in the drift, bottles of spirits in their only comfort. One man was carrying a miniature Union Jack that was nearly torn from his mitten by the wind. McDougall had spent the afternoon writing a royal proclamation and signing his sovereign's name to it. Now, his voice hard to identify in the howl of the storm, he read this proclamation that announced his presence as the legal governor of the Red River settlement. Then he and his men rode back to Pembina, some of them wondering whether this madman would be the death of them. The U.S. reporters loved Wandering Willie. The Yankee papers were full of hilarity that week. John A. Macdonald had one hand over his eyes, the other round a glass of strong stuff. What could the Prime Minister do? He had to fire McDougall, of course, and he had to put off the acquisition of Rupert's Land for a while. He could not send troops against the 24-year-old prophet and hero because the road north of Lake Superior would be closed until summer, and the Americans were not likely to supply a route through their country. Macdonald had to swallow his nation-building pride and listen to catcalls from the loyal opposition. He sent his old pal Donald Smith, the Scottish, of course, ex-Hudson's Bay Company boss and future last spiker, out to the Red River to confront Riel. He was not really afraid of Riel and his half-breeds. He was afraid that the Americans, busy killing Sioux in the area, would find some excuse to march northward. But in sending Smith to speechify and eventually negotiate, he was really recognizing, at least temporarily, an organization called the National Committee of Métis. Louis David Riel, secretary. The promises seemed pretty good. There would be an amnesty, and there would be recognition of property for the locals. There were also a few pecuniary considerations for Métis leaders who were interested in peace. Macdonald was still busy buying votes. It looked as if things would go peacefully, if not completely satisfactorily, for Ottawa's adventure in colonialism. But then some drunken prostitute... We're going to have to edit that. But then some drunken Protestant white guy from Ontario, an orange man named Tom Scott, focused the religious and racial tensions that had always been a political fact in the country. He was a surveyor. He saw himself as part of the future. He got into the HBC booze and went around cursing and threatening half-breeds and papists and French speakers. He rounded up some equally unhappy pals and waved guns in the winter air. There were a lot of Tom Scotts in the country in 1869, just as there are now. But this one was finally arrested by some of the inferior people he hated so much. You can imagine the fury building on both sides. Then, according to the police reports and later legend, Scott hurled himself at Riel's throat with the intention of solving the Métis problem. It was not the first incident of racial religious violence at Fort Garry, but it was tremendously symbolic. What could the people who portrayed themselves as a government do when someone tried to kill the most prominent man in the government? Scott was court-martialed and shot by a firing squad. The story usually goes that the firing squad had liquor on their collective breath. So did Macdonald when he heard about this. Mr. Middle of the Road would not be able to quieten this one down, not with liberal newspapers seizing what appeared to be an opportunity to throw alcohol on the fire, and Quebec threatening to make a saint of Riel. What could John A. Macdonald do? He disappeared for a while. No one could find him, not even his wife or the Governor General. All they knew was that there would be gin in the vicinity. But he reappeared, as he had always done, and now he resolved to order his first foreign military campaign. When the Canadian road allowed in the spring, he would send troops to conquer the Red River Valley. But this was Canada, not the USA. Before the troops, made up of Canadians and Brits, headed to the west, the Métis negotiators arrived in Ottawa, much to the fury of Ontario Orangemen and other racists. Ontario troops arrested the Western enemies. The Dominion government ordered the release of the Western delegates. The result would be the Manitoba Act, which would go into effect in July 1870. The old Red River colony would enter Canada as the province of Manitoba, a word that means roughly God's country. A little smaller in area than New Brunswick, the new province would be unlikely les autres. It would be unlike les autres. The successor of Riel's administration would guarantee the rights of French schools and churches. 12 of the 24 elected representatives in the provincial house would be French-speaking. Riel the lawyer and very young elder statesman prepared to become an important Manitoba politician. But he did not believe in the peaceful intentions of the federal troops. When they appeared at Fort Garry, he went out the back way and headed for his job as a schoolteacher in the USA. Macdonald's government offered him 1,000 Canadian dollars to stay there. Riel said that he could not be bought by the Canadian government. The Hudson's Bay Company offered to throw in 600 British pounds. Riel said he would apply himself to his career as a teacher. But Riel did not disappear. He visited Manitoba often, conferring with his political associates, checking on the delivery of language rights. Then he began his career as a federal politician. His associates ran him successfully in a by-election and then in a regular election. Riel did not campaign much in the new province, but he did go to Ottawa. There, some Quebec and Manitoba members helped him sign the members' roll in the House of Commons. Macdonald never had to face him across the floor, and it is probably one of the saddest stories in Canadian history that he never sat down for a cup of tea with Riel. Macdonald might then have known him for a handsome, energetic politician with a gift for gab. It would have, perhaps, gone well as long as they spoke in English. Macdonald did not speak French. But Macdonald always looked at the youngster as a half-breed who had shown him up in front of the whole country. And of course, a foe of the Prime Minister could not be a friend of the nation. Macdonald should have pondered an event that soon transpired. When rumors of yet another American-based Fenian raid reached Riel's ears, he offered the Métis cavalry to the lieutenant governor of the new province. Macdonald's simple formulas about his enemies were sometimes at odds with reality. If you can say that there was any such thing during the first 5 years of the new Confederation. John A. Macdonald eventually felt that he had to kill Louis David Riel. His son, Hugh John Macdonald, succeeded his father's adversary, becoming the first Conservative Premier of Manitoba in 1900.
Excuse me, sir. Hello?
I'm done. Ha. Louis David Riel, it turned out, had knocked him off his feet. Shortly after getting the Manitoba Act through, Macdonald fell on his face. Fortunately, this did not happen in the House of Commons, where his political antagonists might have laughed at the middle-aged man whose body was filled with pain. The months of negotiations and liquor had done their evil work. The doctors diagnosed the great pain and convulsions as gallstone attacks and alerted the populace to expect a dead prime minister. But this was a man of 100 comebacks. He went to Prince Edward Island to take the sea air and left Georges-Étienne Cartier to handle things for a while. When he got back, he was ready to build a railroad. The railroad would nearly kill him, too. It was 1872, and this father of a growing confederation had to fight a second national election. He had a pretty good record to defend. He had brought in 2 more provinces, and it looked as if PEI would be joining the family soon. He had staved off the secessionist threat in Nova Scotia. He had snaffled some British money to build railroads and canals, and the Americans had not invaded. But he had problems too. It looked as if his Anglophile friend Cartier was not going to live for another session, and Quebec might be hard to hold on. The Protestants in Ontario complained against this deal with the murderous savages in Manitoba. The British had sold Canada's fisheries down the tubes in the War Reparations meeting in Washington. The Conservative Party, though a well-organized machine, was just about broke and a little run down. Macdonald tried all his familiar tricks, hinting free trade to free traders, hinting protection to protectionists. Noticing that his old nemesis George Brown was having labor problems at the Globe, he announced that he was interested in making unions legal. But the main issue of this election was going to be the Canadian Pacific Railway, the huge financial gamble for a continental Canada. The line was supposed to be started within 2 years of BC's joining the team. There were already US tracks poking northward. The problem was, of course, the fact that Canada was new and underpopulated, and therefore rather light of tax base. The adventure would not only be the biggest engineering event of the continent, it would also be the most expensive. Hugh Macdonald could not make a go of a store in Kingston. How would his son do with a railroad 4,000 miles long? The obvious answer would be US money. But Macdonald did not like US money, as everyone knew. His Scottish friend, Hugh Allen, had made it big in shipping and was now the head of Montreal-based Canadian Pacific Railroad Company. But there were a lot of Yankee dollars in that company. Macdonald reasoned that Yankee dollars would result in 2 unacceptable eventualities. Canadian economic and political policies would come under the threat of American control, and news of the business would result in a lost election of 1872. Get rid of those US backers, Macdonald told Allen, or we do not sign this contract. All right, said Allen, the US partners are gone. All right, we will sign pretty soon, said Macdonald. But Hugh Allen had just shuffled some papers. The US partners were still there, just invisible. We do not know whether Macdonald was fooled or just pretended he was fooled. There was an election campaign going on, and Macdonald could easily lose his own seat in Kingston, but he did not have time to mend local fences. Businessmen were complaining about the lack of reciprocity. Farmers were demanding tariffs. Fishermen were ready to shoot at US boats or Tory candidates. And there was a 3-year-old hydrocephalic daughter waiting for his kind words. Now his other Scottish friend, David McPherson, gave him yet another reason to open a bottle of port. McPherson had organized a collection to pay off MacDonald's massive personal debts. What a good friend. But McPherson was also the head of a big Toronto-based railroad company. He felt he should have the huge contract that looked as if it were going to Hugh Allen. There were lots of votes in Ontario, he might have suggested, and they might not take too kindly to the big contract going to Montreal. They had not forgotten the murder of Tom Scott either. What a surprise! Macdonald had to reconcile the venomously competitive demands of the two old Canadas. Day after day, he used all his liberal conservative wiles to try to bring the two companies together. Night after night, he more successfully negotiated a quart or two of the old remedy. Allen said that his company would be prepared to let McPherson come aboard. McPherson said that he would not accept an inferior spot. Election day was coming. Macdonald was glassy-eyed. He staggered from meetings to hustings. He had a nip in his carriage. It was really hard to maintain his famous affability and sly wit. He was really afraid that his career might be at an end. A climax of sorts occurred at a debate in his home riding. Something snapped in the old Tomorrow's brain, and the electors were treated to the spectacle of a 57-year-old head of government lurching across the platform and trying to strangle his liberal opponent. John A. Macdonald was no Tom Scott, though. He would live to fight another day. What the electors did not know was that he and his running mates were being heavily financed by Hugh Allen, leading candidate for the big railroad contract. Allen had scads of money, and he put at least $350,000, $1872 into the hands of the Conservatives for this election. As election day neared, the money became more and more necessary. Macdonald was tired and often under the influence. How was he supposed to keep track? He was used to buying votes. He was pretty sure he was not being bought, but a desperate contender can make mistakes. In the last days, he sent a hastily scribbled telegram to Montreal. It comprised this famous message: "I must have another 10,000. Will be the last time calling. Do not fail me. Answer today." The money was promptly forthcoming. The telegram was locked away in a safe at the office of Allen's lawyers. The Conservatives just barely won the election. Cartier had been defeated in Montreal. The new voters in Manitoba and British Columbia gave the government an edge. John A. had a drink to celebrate. Joseph Howe, the Nova Scotia independentist, had not been able to beat Macdonald. George Brown had tried and failed. Edward Blake, the Liberal voice, and his stalking horse, Sandy Mackenzie, had not quite pulled it off. Louis David Réal was somewhere on the American prairie, but Sir Hugh Allen, the shipping tycoon, would do the job. Macdonald used his experience and his cronies to handle the first few punches. An American businessman with a Scottish name laid some documents in front of Macdonald, showing that there was a lot of Yankee money in the Allen deal and a lot of Allen money in the Conservative campaign. He suggested that he would keep quiet if the government signed with Allen. Macdonald called on old Francis Hincks, the slickest politician in Canada, to make arrangements with Allen and the Americans. Hincks knew a lot of people from a lot of backgrounds. Pretty soon the Americans went home, and Allen was off to Britain, looking for replacement funds. Macdonald was sobering up, but he was worried. He did not feel as if he were a crook, but he knew that there were certain things in the relationship with Allen that he would prefer remain only rumors. However, here he was with a new mandate and lots of work to do. He faced the future, unaware that his fate would be decided by a kind of 19th century Watergate. It would be called the Pacific Scandal. That crazed telegram was still lying among other touchy files in the office safe of J.J.C. Abbott, the shipping tycoon's lawyer. J.J.C. Abbott had a clerk named George Norris, and George Norris had a key to the safe. He usually worked long hours, but not usually after midnight. One late winter night, he was working well after midnight, opening the safe and removing certain files. These eventually appeared on the political market for $5,1873. It turned out the buyer was a liberal. Fancy that. The first session of Macdonald's new parliament became a national theatre offering high tragedy and grim comedy. The country's newspapers were shrill with headlines and cartoons. The opposition worked slowly, as if savoring their moment. Chubby Edward Blake sprawled in his chair and smirked across the floor at the Prime Minister, while a backbencher announced the Macdonald's Railroad was an American organization, and Allen had bought the Conservatives with Yankee money. The first problem had been taken care of. How serious was the second? What did those scoundrels know? The newspapers were looking for more. The Liberals demanded an investigation by committee. Macdonald had the idea voted down. Then some advisors got in his ear, and he allowed the investigation to proceed. The newspapers made bigger headlines. The word scandal was used more and more often, and when the big money people in Britain read it, they told Allen to go home. Etienne Cartier, without a seat in Parliament, his secrets in the hands of burglars, escaped the commotion by dying of Bright's disease in the London he liked so much. One way of looking at the opposition's work is to decide that the Liberals were performing a service, rooting out corruption, protecting democracy. Another would suggest self-interest, dirty politics, character assassination. Well, John A. Macdonald had never denied that he was a good, opportunistic, practical politician himself. If he were going to wrap himself in the flag, it would be a flag manufactured and supplied by a company that enjoyed conservative patronage. But now, Macdonald was in his bed, sick and tiddly, crushed by the circumstances and fearful of the future. He was thinking about resigning his ministry and retiring from politics. His backers and the Governor-General talked him out of it. They knew that no Conservative in the House was ever the fourth or fifth best candidate to lead the new country. Macdonald saw Edward Blake's horrible smile in his dreams. He went to his summer place in Rivière-du-Loup, where he could be with his family, take pleasant walks, and view the St. Lawrence, and he read the newspapers. One day in July, he read the Montreal Herald, a grit newspaper as unfriendly as Brown's Globe. There he was quoted, "I must have another 10,000, etc., etc." Macdonald disappeared again. His cabinet could not find him. Agnes could not find him. No one could find him. And again, the newspapers were full of the rumors of his death. But he showed up in Ottawa when the House of Commons was ready to sit again, and he staggered to his office. It was to be the worst parliamentary season of his life. Through a haze of pain and alcohol, he saw his allies drift away from him, saving their own moral images and, in his view, dooming Confederation. Words never failed him, but numbers did. At the end of 1873, his resignation was in the hands of Lord Dufferin. He would spend the winter alone, emptying bottles of port and reading French novels in translation. All his work to build a nation from Atlantic to Pacific looked as if it could come down like McNabb's railway trestle.